Hi, everybody. I'm Jess Kimball. I'm an author based in Southern Vermont, just about a half hour from Keene. I moved to the area a few years ago and just have been visiting my whole life and really fell in love with it here. So it was important to me to do an event in the community. I am a birth and postpartum doula as my full-time job, but wrote this book. It's just a memoir about my experience as a doula and my experience with the untraditional education path that I chose. Um, I graduated high school when I was 16, and ever since graduating high school, I seem to hear this constant thing from everyone around me that college was a vital life experience that I needed to have. When my business became a little more successful as a doula and I was fully supporting myself with that, a lot of people stopped saying that the education was what was important and that I didn't necessarily need the degree, but that the important part was the social experience and the people I would meet there. Um, and even though I didn't fully agree, I just kind of had that in the back of my head for a really long time. And I felt like it would never really go away unless I had some sort of college experience. It wasn't necessarily planned, but I audited a class at Dartmouth. It was a sociology course, health disparities. And throughout the process of auditing that class, I began auditing other classes and meeting a lot of people on campus. I was 18 when it started, about to turn 19. So I was the same age as all of the other students in the class. So a lot of people will audit courses at Dartmouth and they're older, but for me, it was a bit of a different experience because I was the same age as everybody. I was on the phone with my mom one day and I said something that I thought I would never say in my entire life. I said, I just got out of class and I'm getting ready to go to a frat party. And that was not an experience I ever thought I would want to have. And she said, you're kind of a genius because your brother's in college, drowning in student debt, trying to figure out what he wants to do with his life, trying to figure out if he's going to have a job after college, where he's going to live. And you're doing all of that while running a business and you're getting that experience for free. And for me, there wasn't much stress behind it because I did the class assignments, but I didn't necessarily have to, and they didn't count for anything. For me, it was important because I wanted to gain that knowledge and continue my education through the courses. But the professors were very much just allowing me to participate as much as I wanted to. Um, Throughout the experience, I got to write my first college research paper and get feedback on that, and really did learn a lot. But I got to also have the full social experience of college. Um, and that was something that a lot of people were constantly telling me about, that I would make connections with people unlike any other. And for me, I had already gone and lived in France alone at 17. I had traveled the world, and I felt like those experiences were much more vital in the growth and me becoming the person I am today than going to college and those social experiences would have been. Um, so the book is basically just a collection of all of the stories and experiences I had on campus. It started out just me writing down funny little things I noticed in the notes app on my phone. And then when the pandemic happened, I started to look through those notes I had and was like, okay, I want to write something mainly for myself. I felt like writing has always been very therapeutic for me, and I wanted to write all those experiences down to look back on. And then I was talking to a friend and I thought, if this book existed when I was in high school and I read it, I probably would have felt a lot more confident in the decisions I made, knowing that someone else had chose an untraditional route. So a few weeks after making that decision, I realized I had an entire book and decided to submit it, and it was published. So that's kind of how the book came to be. Since then, I still live in Vermont and I've been working as a doula. So I support families through pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. Ultimately, even though I said I didn't want to have the full college experience, I did decide to enroll in nursing school because I felt that I needed that degree to continue my career and do what I want to do, which is become a midwife. Um, I'm still choosing a more untraditional route, doing a combination of online school and going a little bit in person for clinicals and things like that. But for me, I feel like the experience I had at Dartmouth really satisfied the wonder I had about the social part of college and what it was like on campus, but it was enough for me to have that desire fulfilled and still continue my education, but not have that campus experience again. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I'm going to take this opportunity to just open the floor to questions.
Do you think that pursuing a non-traditional route kind of gave you space to explore your interests in a different way than maybe some of the other people that you encountered? Especially like you were talking about auditing a class at Dartmouth and being the same age as everyone else. Like, do you think that you had not necessarily a leg up, but a different experience than they did in terms of being able to explore what you really wanted to do, you were really passionate about?
Absolutely. Since I was just auditing classes, I had the freedom to take any class I wanted to, as long as the professor said yes to me auditing. So I wasn't put in classes that I didn't want to take. I only took classes that were interesting to me. It also was very interesting because in the health disparities class, my experience as a doula and traveling the world, I feel like gave me a leg up in the course. We talked a lot about disparities in maternal health care. And the professor would call on me and say, this is your area of expertise. Go on up and you can lead this part of the course, which was not something other students had the opportunity to do. When we talked about the midwives model of care and how that's not necessarily the model we follow in the US. My experience living in France and abroad gave me a different perspective because I knew the healthcare system there. We also talked about food and how food is produced and our access to food based on income and socioeconomic level. And I had a different perspective on that because I saw the way food was produced in Europe and the access to organic food. And I got to come back to the US and see how we didn't really have that here. Not in the way that it's accessible to all people in France. Here, it's not necessarily accessible to low-income families.
What was it that made you decide to want to be a doula? What was the initial draw?
So I'm one of 7 kids, and growing up, my mom told me very interesting stories of all of our births. My older brother was born in the car on the way to the hospital, and my younger brother was born in the shower at home with a midwife there. That was a planned home birth, but the car was not planned. And I just always had this really huge interest in birth and babies, and growing up we were always surrounded by that. Every one of my siblings has been very interested, but for me it was more of this is what I want to do with my life sort of thing. At 15 I was getting into photography and decided to go and photograph a birth, and about 5 months after photographing that birth I was certified as a doula. So when I graduated high school I already had that certification complete. But I think a huge part of it, my interest in birth comes from my mom, but the reason I became a doula was because the birth I attended had a doula there, and she was the one who suggested I go and get certified.
You mentioned like access to food availability and differing healthcare practices when you were traveling. How else do you think that your travel experiences have informed your work going forward?
I think a huge part of it is just the culture in each place I've gone to and seeing what traditions they have around birth. Um, and also just the access to care. When I lived in Hawaii, the access to midwifery care was very different than it was, say, in South Carolina, where I grew up. And then it's been even more different here in Vermont and New Hampshire. In Vermont and New Hampshire, we have a higher access to midwifery care, while in South Carolina, in North Carolina, there were more restrictions around care. I actually created a documentary in February of this year called the Vermont Birth Experience. And it's just about the different providers we have in Vermont and all of the people that are part of that team that make the birth outcome so great here. Because Vermont and New Hampshire are two of the top states to start a family in. We have some of the best birth outcomes up here, and the maternal mortality rate is much lower here than in the South.
What led you to choose Dartmouth for auditing classes? Is it proximity, or are there certain professors or programs that you were?
So I was living in White River Junction, Vermont at that point in time, and I had a couple friends who were students. So I already had been on campus a little bit, just like would meet up with a friend for coffee sort of thing. My first day in Hanover, I was working with a family in May of 2019, and it was the first time I had gone to Hanover. And I had just planned to stay there for a few weeks and go back down south. At that point in time, I had lived in Vermont before, but had moved back to South Carolina and was just up here. My grandparents lived in Springfield, Vermont, so I was visiting them and working. But my first day in Hanover, I called my mom back home and I said, I'm not going to come back. For the first time in my life, I feel like I can breathe. And I think I found the place that I meant to settle and build my life. And that same day, I went back to my grandparents' house, and my grandfather said, it's funny you say that because your great grandfather went to Dartmouth, and he graduated in 34, and he was spending his afternoons on the green and on campus the same way you're kind of starting to. So for me, it felt very like full circle. I think having friends that were students was what really pushed me to be on campus a lot. And then some of my doula clients are Dartmouth professors and Dartmouth staff. So I had that connection. And also it's free to audit classes at Dartmouth. Other colleges, you have to pay a fee. So the fact that it was free and I could just email a professor and say, hey, can I take your class, made it extremely accessible for me.
What were some of the like culture shock or craziest experiences that you encountered when you started going to classes there?
I think for me, it was a bit of a, it made me realize that I have done this thing in my life. And I think part of it was just the town that I grew up in, where I'm a good conversationalist. So when I meet people, I'm good at figuring out something we have in common and connecting on that. But I discovered at Dartmouth, I would talk about things that didn't really matter to me. They were parts of my life that were true and experiences I had, but I felt more obligated to talk about how my dad used to travel the world as a triathlete and won one of the hardest triathlons, which is something that is amazing, and I'm very proud to have him as my dad, but it wasn't something that really mattered all that much to me. But I felt like I needed to talk about those things in my life to connect with these students, because they all came from these families that were highly successful and a really big deal. But then I started to meet more people who came from lower income areas and were first generation college students. And I think that made me realize that this bias I had from those first few weeks on campus wasn't 100% true, that there were these students who had a very different experience and came from lower income areas or just didn't have access to the things that these other students did because of the families they were born into, and they worked really hard to get there. I think that the dating culture on campus was a huge shock to me. Looking back, it makes a lot of sense. Nobody is really committed to each other because they're so focused on school, they don't really have the time. But I had gone from being around other entrepreneurs and people who are much older than me, and then being on campus was a bit of like, okay, this feels like high school again, and I don't really like it.
Now, you mentioned graduating high school at 16 and starting your own business. How did you, I guess I just want to know a little bit more about how all that got started. What what drew you to start your own business as opposed to anything else. That's really cool.
So thank you. So doulas are usually self-employed. There's some agencies, but most doulas are self-employed. So initially when I started the business, I was just doing it part-time. I couldn't really imagine doing it as a full-time job because I heard from so many people how hard it was to manage all of that and how unstable the income was. Because you might have a month where you're attending 4 births, you might have a month where you're attending 10, you might attend 0 one month. And even looking back at this year, I specialize in postpartum care, but there's definitely like a huge flux in my income month to month, and it's steady now, and I'm lucky enough that my business has been successful. But when I started out, I was also teaching preschool and doing other things. I had a miscarriage and moved back to South Carolina, um, and that was a huge push for me to get more involved in doula work because I realized just how isolating those experiences are. Um, and I felt like people say it takes a village, but the village doesn't seem to be there anymore. I even I feel like it was starting to go away when I was a kid. I don't remember my mom having a huge support system, partially because we moved to South Carolina and she was a mother of 7 and all our family was up north. But I do recall people like help. My sister was critically ill when I was younger, and I recall people, helping get us off the bus when my mom was at the hospital with my sister and doing little things like that. And I feel like even just that simple, having the neighbor get your kids off the bus isn't really there anymore. Um, and it seems like with the postpartum period, people really want to come and hold the baby and tell you how cute your baby is and then leave. Um, and they're not really offering much support to the parents. Um, and that became very evident to me, and I wanted to become involved in trying to change that. Um, so then when I was in South Carolina, when I moved back there, I took an internship as a newborn care specialist, and I hated it. I hated the place I worked for. And I decided, you know what, I'm just going to quit, and whatever happens, happens. And a month later, I was moving to Hawaii with a family. And then a few months after that, I was in Hanover and was fully booked for the next 2.5 years. So to today, I'm fully booked through December of this year. Um, so I don't know. I just had to take that leap, and I had the ability to do that because I had moved back in with my parents. So if I took that leap and it failed, I didn't have much to worry about. Um, but it was still a little nerve wracking. Everyone was telling me I needed a degree to fall back on, but it worked out. So
How could you be booked so far ahead? I mean, how were these people who predicted that they were going to have a child at a certain time, or how
well,
could?
so a lot of families book me when they find out they're pregnant, so they can book me up to 9 months in advance. So families that are due in December are or in July. They're 4 months pregnant, 5 months pregnant right now.
Oh, but okay, I must have misunderstood. I thought you said 2.5 years. I guess what you meant is that you would book steadily for 2.5.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
All right.
You mentioned this sense of community being necessary for families, and having had all these experiences with families now, what are some of the most touching or meaningful moments of community that you have witnessed being in your line of work?
I mean, there's a lot of families that I stay in touch with for years. I actually had a family in South Carolina reach out to me and ask if I would be willing to come back down for the birth of their second baby. Their first is going to be 3. Um, so we've stayed in touch for the past 3 years. Um, I mean, I think people have this idea that my job is full of just these wonderful, happy moments, but a lot of it is really tough to see. And a lot of people have traumatic birth experiences or postpartum experiences. And it feels very sacred to me to be invited into that space and accepted as a member of their family. Um, I mean, I feel like every day I'm getting a text from someone and it's, hey, here's a picture of the baby. She's crawling now, or she's walking now, or some milestone, and they'll invite me over for dinner. And I stay in touch with these families and I see them out in the community. And um, that feels really special to me.
Earlier,
Oh, sorry about that.
well, it just, I don't know how off topic this can be, but this will be. I suppose the families that hire you are more open to ideas such as organic and whole foods diets. I'm curious if you've ever worked for people who just wouldn't go anywhere near that route,
I
but
think
would
that,
still.
oh, sorry.
No, but I mean, the reason I ask is you don't hear about it much anymore. But you did 40 years ago. It still exists, but pharmaceuticals and medical industry and food industry basically have pushed it away. But there are people who really get non-functional if they don't get whole foods. I mean, I go as organic as I can, but what's essential is I'll take, like, say, I'll take a non-organic brown rice before I'll take a white rice.
Yeah.
That's an organic white rice because it doesn't matter, it makes me sick.
Yeah.
The brown rice, but it's a very peculiar case, and I believe that this syndrome is common, but we don't hear about it because people get sent to mental health. My mother suffered this syndrome. I believe I picked up problems in her womb. I was a cesarean. She was in her late 30s. I was her only child. But I found eventually, and the symptomatology was unspeakably bizarre, as well as horrible. The psychiatric drugging in childhood made it worse, which shouldn't surprise anyone. But then I started to eat real food, and I began to get better. So I wondered if you had any observations in terms of the diet of families for whom you worked, and whether it seemed like it made a difference. Was it more difficult the farther away from a healthy diet they were? I don't know how to phrase this in few words, but
So I think first I want to say what you said about conditions developed in the womb and that experience. I think that's really interesting, and there's a lot of research that's being done on that now, showing emotionally, physically what's happening to the pregnant person, how that affects the baby. As far as food goes, a lot of the families I've worked with, and I think part of it is my services are right now considered a luxury, and one of my goals is to get them covered by insurance, and that's just a long road. But I try to use grant funding and scholarships and things for families. But the fact that I work with a lot of higher income families who are highly educated, I think influences the type of diet they're eating, because they have a lot of knowledge on food. I work with a lot of doctors and a lot of athletes, so they are eating a lot of organic food. I think there definitely is a connection in the postpartum experience and experience in pregnancy, and what the person's eating. A lot of other countries, they have traditions around postpartum where the woman doesn't get out of bed for a certain amount of days, and it only eats hot meals that are brought to her that are all organic whole foods. I think we don't see as much of that in the US. I think that we would have much better outcomes if we did follow those traditions, partially because part of that is that they're not getting out of bed as soon, so the physical recovery is better. But also, I think that what we eat is a huge factor in our health. I mean, a lot of health issues that we look at, we should be healing our body from the inside out, and that's through our food.
May I say this? I'm often accused of talking too much, but I do come from an unusual paradigm. Although I could pass optical and audio tests, I mean, the test, fine. but tonal range was lacking. I couldn't perceive tonal range well enough to make out the color and texture of a bird flying or sound well enough to play a harmonica till I was 31 years old, a couple of years after I kind of got into the, well, I was introduced to it through 5-phase Chinese medicine. I don't know if you've heard of that. But so, I mean, what you just said resonates. You know, it really resonates.
I'm glad.
You mentioned doula work and postpartum care as being seen as a luxury rather than a necessity in this country. How do you think that impacts the work that you're able to do and the services that you're able to provide with that kind of as the cultural baseline?
I think that it's tough. It's a constant battle within myself of like, okay, I think these services should be offered to everyone, but I also need to make an income to support myself. And I can't always charge an extremely low rate because I can't support myself on that. And because then people will expect other doulas in the community to do that. And maybe they don't have the ability to do that. So it's not fair to them for me to just offer these services for free. I also think that offering them for free creates this idea in the community that they're not worth paying for, that the work we're doing is not worth being paid for. It should just be volunteer work. So for me, I reached out to the Dorothy Byrne Foundation and they gave a donation of $3,000 that covered postpartum services for a family that had triplets while they were in grad school. So I was able to offer that. World Breastfeeding Week is coming up in August. So I'm doing a donation-based photo shoot up in Burlington, Vermont. So if anyone who's in the photo shoot happens to make a donation, that'll go towards covering doula services for families who can't access it. I had one insurance company cover services for a family. It was a very small percentage of the services. The reason they covered it was because this person had a mental health condition and they felt covering postpartum services would help prevent a relapse. And it would cost the insurance less to cover the services than to cover the cost of care if she were to relapse. But I think it's very unfair that the services aren't accessible to everyone. I try up in Vermont has a couple like family child centers, parent child centers. So in Springfield, Vermont, I've been trying to offer services, just educational services to parents through that organization and having them cover it. The family place in Norwich, Vermont did a virtual newborn care class. So even families in Keene were able to attend it just on Zoom, and they covered the cost of me teaching that. And then it was free for anyone to attend. So I really try to make it accessible, but I think that insurance needs to, that's going to be a huge part of it, is if insurance covers it. And also I think looking into offering it as an employee benefit. There's a bunch of, I'd say, unique benefits that employers are offering, and doula services could be one of them. I think CVS Pharmacies was the one that just approved it. It's a very limited amount that they cover, but it's something.
May I comment on that score? That, and there is a relationship. That's one of my odd abilities. I seek interconnections, but they're there once you look at them. I was on Medicaid until I got old enough for Medicare, which was a couple of years ago. But they limit how much they will pay for chiropractic. There is a medical industry. It costs one operation on a person's back. Costs enough to go to a chiropractor twice a week for like a year, you know, but they won't cover it. They will cover the operation. But now paradoxically, and again, I grew up because of this disability, because I can work, but I can't hold down a job because of symptoms, and the symptoms are not mental, they're physiological, but that's off topic. But you know, what they'll do now, because the hospitals and insurance companies are beginning to get overwhelmed. So conversely, which they've done quite a bit all along, but what they're doing is they're trying to, if you have an operation and whoever's covering you doesn't feel like covering it, they claim it's in your head. Go to your local $3 psychiatric or whatever it is, $5, $10 psychiatric clinic, because you don't really have this condition. We don't care about the x-rays. We don't care about, this is frightening. And I think it also relates to midwifery, et cetera, that there's not an industry, there's not a multi-billion-dollar industry making money off of it. And so it's.
Well, one of the things that was really interesting to me when I took health disparities was I wrote a research paper on the maternal mortality rate in the United States, and we have the highest of any developed country. Returning to the midwives model of care and having continuous labor support would decrease the maternal and infant mortality rate by up to 83% worldwide. Midwives in our hospitals cannot provide continuous labor support, but doulas can. So having doulas in hospital is really great. But the hospitals that are having them are having them as volunteers, which is making it seem like the services aren't worth paying for. But it's really interesting because when we say maternal mortality, it includes deaths that are happening in pregnancy and postpartum, not just while you're giving birth. So 4 to 5 of the deaths that are labeled maternal mortality rate are labeled maternal mortality are happening in our community. But I think it just goes to show that insurance doesn't care so much about community. It cares about making money. And they could easily cover these services and prevent upwards of 80% of these deaths.
That's a question. There was a book, Midwives, written in Vermont by a man named Begolian. It was fictionalized. It was about, I believe it was published in the late 90s. But you might want to look into it. It's a novel, but it's apparently based on events. And it's interesting. It's harrowing. One thing we're not going to have in human societies is perfection. But, you know, when someone in a standard position, say in medicine, makes a mistake, well, they make a mistake, oh, mistakes will happen. They make another mistake, well, they're a bad doctor. But if someone in any way alternative makes a mistake, oh, well, you know those people. I mean, it's one woman was putting down, a poetry group I'm in was putting down supplements and vitamins, et cetera. Well, there is a difference between a huckster who is offering his or her surefire, you know, mineral vitamin concoction that's going to cure everything, and she was concentrating on multiple sclerosis. There's a difference between that and looking into the research that shows that there are, if applied properly, there are ways of avoiding. It was called preventive medicine, and it overlaps alternative medicine. But I just wanted to comment that you know, if we could reduce the mortality rate, and it would save money, you know, some corporation would object to it. I'm leaving something in the chat you might want to glance at.
Do you think that the trend toward sort of holistic health in general is kind of driving a shift towards your work eventually being considered more of an essential service? Like, are you seeing that kind of pick up over time as you continue?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are educating themselves on just different options in birth. But I think a huge part of it is that our maternal mortality in the US is you're 4 times more likely to die during childbirth if you're a person of color. So a lot of these pregnant women who are Black don't want to go to hospitals, so they're looking into other options. And talk about that in media is spreading the word to all groups of people. So a lot of people are saying, okay, well, even if I'm not Black, it's still dangerous for me to give birth. What other options do I have?
Uh, you're young, so you may not be aware, but there was a strong resistance to chiropractic,
Yes.
and it was often the more bizarre, zany people who, had the temerity and the resolve to get involved with it and promote it and practice it, which in turn kind of gave impetus because, oh, look at that crazy, and believe me, I've got a lot of this in various ways in my own life because I do have some skills, but not necessarily as a chiropractor, but look at this person, they're crazy. No wonder, this is what chiropractors are. But those were the people that got the door open. Till finally, when I was growing up, they finally began to become established, so that now even private insurance covers them. Because many private insurance companies have realized that, again, sending them to the chiropractor is less money than paying for a back operation later on. However, Medicaid doesn't feel that way. So it leaves many of us out in the cold.
Yeah. Are there any other questions?
Looks like that might be it for questions, but Jess, this has been so interesting. And I just wanted to remind everyone that we do have copies of your book in the store, so come by and pick one up, or you can order one online from our website as well.
I'll just answer that question out loud. You asked how old I am. I'm 20. I think that's the last question. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was really great. This was a very interesting discussion.
Thanks so much.